My name is Matthew Schooley. I'm the president of the 44th Cemetery Association. I am the head of the board that runs the cemetery and the 44th Meeting House. And why don't you come and join Nancy Lykos and me, and we will go up and visit the grave of Governor Henry Martin Hoyt and his granddaughter, the notorious Eleanor Wiley. Nancy, the history of the 44th Cemetery actually starts in 1769 with the first 40 settlers coming and creating the fort here in 44th. And they designated a burial ground which was not many yards from where the actual original fort was. Years later, in 1807, this burial site was used as the site for the first meeting house, which is one of the oldest buildings, as we have been discussing, here in Wyoming Valley. So in the original old yard around the meeting house are many of the old valley names. And maybe we can go around and seek out Luke Swetland and Tiffany Swetland and Daniel and Lois Hoyt, Lazarus Dennison. There's a monolith there for Nathan Dennison. He was probably buried here. And James Bird. We actually have several Indians who were buried in this cemetery, so we'll head on around. This marker is to Henry Martin Hoyt, who was the governor of the state of Pennsylvania. I think it's 1872 to 1876. He was at the Battle of Gettysburg and considered a hero, and as many heroes of wars, he became involved in politics, and after that he had a private law practice in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, which is where he lived, and did very well at that. And this is his family. Ziba Hoyt was his father, and that monument is immediately behind. And Ziba was the father of the Daniel Hoyt family, which is buried over. Daniel Hoyt and Ziba were brothers, but the Hoyts in the old graveyard and this Hoyt family were both from Kingston Corners. Those are separate Hoyts in terms of the Hoyt Library and in terms of Governor Hoyt. And Governor Hoyt married one of the Lovelands. That's also another very old family from Wyoming Valley, the Kingston area, and they are directly next to the Hoyts here. Many old names of the valley are all in this area. We have Shoemakers on the right here. We have the Strong family and the Reynolds family that continue around here, the Fuller family. It's a who's who of early 19th century history here in Wyoming Valley. In 1838, the Reverend George Peck proposed a Methodist school of higher education, and that eventually was realized as Wyoming Seminary. And the graveyard here is, or used to have, 4 of the presidents of Wyoming Seminary. The Reverend Reuben Nelson was the very first president of Wyoming Seminary when it was created. Young C. Smith, Levi Sprague. These are all names, when you go down to Wyoming Seminary, are prominent on their buildings. Wilbur Fleck is the last of these. But after the flood of Agnes, Wyoming Seminary erected this monument to these particular gentlemen who were very much a part of the history of that school. Well, following the Battle of Wyoming in August, late August, Luke Swetland, who was from Wyoming, was on an expedition to the Nanticoke area to grind some grain. And at that time, he was captured by the Indians along with one of the Blanchards who lived on the other side of the Susquehanna River from the Swetlands. Luke Swetland was in captivity for almost a year and finally escaped and found his way back to Connecticut, wrote his memoirs about his adventures with the Indians, and then eventually met up with his family and came back to the valley. And he was the oldest member of the building committee for the 40 Fort Meeting House. Part of the stories that I like to emphasize is the story of the women. And Hannah Tiffany had a large family, and when her husband did not come home that fateful day, she was able to gather all of her children and her son Belding and managed to go from here back to Connecticut, which is where they finally ended up reuniting with Luke Swetland. The Swetland homestead is still here in Wyoming Valley. Luke Swetland's grandson, William Swetland, was instrumental in establishing the cemetery and also was instrumental in maintaining the meeting house long after it had been abandoned by the religious organizations that originally built it and used it. But Hannah Tiffany Swetland must have been quite a personality to be able to supply stuff for the Revolutionary War in terms of food and munitions, and also raise a family, feed that family, while her husband was somewhere else. So here's an example of somebody we don't talk about much, but truly had quite a history. If we come over here, another one of the major families of Wyoming Valley were the Dennisons, and this monolith here is to the Dennison family and Nathan Dennison. Nathan Dennison was the one of the heroes of the Battle of Wyoming, and one of the few people who managed to live beyond it. And his family became quite prominent in the valley, and his son, Lazarus Dennison, was also on the building committee for the 40 Fort Meeting House. Behind here we have Daniel Hoyt. Daniel Hoyt is this grave right here. He also was on the building committee for the meeting house and was from Kingston Corners. Daniel's family, actually, I can't remember if it's son or grandson, Samuel Hoyt, was a part of the incorporators of the Lackawanna and Bloomsburg Railroad Company. That was a very successful company established in 1852. And eventually his great-grandson gave the Hoyt Library to the people of Kingston. And Daniel's grandson, or son, Samuel, built the mansion that was is the Hoyt Library. Now this is a grave of a man who was convicted of treason right after the War of 1812 up in New York State, and you can read what is on the marker there, but he had left his duty station to go to New Orleans, and that was interpreted as a treasonous act because he left his duty station. And we're not really sure exactly why this was such an issue, but he was hung and considered a traitor, and it wasn't until years later that the actual story came out, and that he was not deserting his station but was going to continue on with the war effort. And the Luzerne County chapter of the Daughters of the War of 1812 erected this monument, as it says there, in 1935, but the original monument is next to it, which is a lovely slate monument. In the old part of the cemetery here, we have many stones that are typical of very, very early 19th century and late 18th century markers. But James Byrd was one of our famous sons. Just further over here, we have some interesting monuments that you don't see often. These are monuments to Indians that were buried here in the cemetery. We have no information on them. The stone, if you come over here, have wonderful markings on them, and I'm not sure exactly what those markings mean, but we have been told in the history of this cemetery that they were Indians who were buried here, probably in the early 19th century, but we really don't know. The cemetery itself was incorporated in 1860, and the very first parcel of ground was contiguous to the meeting house, and then there were 3 other parcels in the successive years added on to it. At one time, we were told there were somewhere around 32 acres here. There are now only 17 acres of the cemetery, but we've lost a great deal because of the levee system that had to be built following the flood of 1936 and Agnes of 72. And just recently in the 1990s, they raised the dike a little further, and every time they raise the dike, it consumes a little more land. So, so we've gone down in the size of the cemetery. This cemetery was started as a private enterprise. It was a non-sectarian cemetery, so that we have in this cemetery Jews and Muslims and Christians and agnostics and Indians. So anyway, over here, this is another part of the famous sons of Wyoming Valley, but the Swetland family. William Swetland, the grandson of Luke Swetland, was a very, very prosperous businessman. And he married the daughter, or his daughter married Payne Pettibone. And the Payne Pettibone house is still in existence. It's across the street from the Wyoming Monument in Wyoming. A very large house, and has a wonderful statue of Mercury on the side of it, still there. But these monoliths here are for William Swetland and his son-in-law Payne Pettibone. This is the William Swetland monument right here. and this is the Payne Pettibone Monument, and all of these graves are children's graves of the Sweatlands and the Pettibones, and they had many children. And as a matter of fact, to this day, one of our board members is Dorothy Darling Mengelsdorf, and she lives in California, but it has a house here at Bear Lake and comes back every year. She is directly descended from Luke Sweatland, the person we were just talking about who was captured by the Indians and taken up to New York State. We're fortunate here that we have a lot of history, but an interesting piece of this history, this mausoleum in front of us, is your standard Doric temple, and it was built by a man named Edward Barber, and not Edward Butler, and he married a barber from West Pittston, and then he was at a newspaper in Scranton, Pennsylvania, married a local person, and then went up to New York State, which is where he was from, and founded the Buffalo Evening News, and became extremely prosperous. And his son ran that same newspaper, and but for some reason they decided that the father, Edward, and his wife, and I think 2 of their infant children, are buried in that mausoleum there. So these are not the Butlers from Wyoming Valley, but a Butler family from New York State. We have a family of 4 people who, by the name of Palmer, who were in Chicago in 1903 and were all killed in the Iroquois Theater fire, which was quite a happening, in that 605 people died in that fire, and up until that time it was the largest disaster of a fire and loss of life ever in the history of theaters or single building fires. Now that's way on the other side of the cemetery here, but following that fire, actually what happened during the fire was the management had locked many of the escape routes because they didn't want people sneaking in to the theater for this particular event, and when the fire happened, those doors could not be opened. And that spurred building code regulations to have what is known as a panic bar on all public facility doors. So that panic bar that you are so accustomed to these days was something that was in existence but not utilized until after the Iroquois Theater disaster. In 1972, in June, we suffered a major disaster here in the cemetery as well as in the valley itself, and that was the flood of Agnes. And what happened was the diking system that was in place was faulty, and it started to erode beneath a corrugated wall that was the very top of the levee system, and broke through. And when it broke through, it created a whirlpool right here, dislodging 1,400 some grave sites. And of the 1,400 100 grave sites, only a handful of people were able to be identified. So following the flood of '72, when the board was putting back the cemetery, they decided to create a memorial park because it was physically impossible to recreate the cemetery, and financially impossible as it existed before the flood. So this monument here is to those people who were buried here and dislodged and swept throughout the town. The bodies were collected and reinterred in the Mount Zion Cemetery, which is not too far from here, and then a monument dedicating the memorial park was put up about 7 years following the flood. And we were lucky that the VFW Post 283 here in Kingston has been extremely kind to us in replacing flagpoles. We have 2 flagpoles in this cemetery, one here behind the monument, and another one which was right there, and that's the Soldiers and Sailors Monument flagpole, which used to be right at the main entrance of the cemetery. The main entrance was on Wyoming Avenue originally, but has changed since then. And so we are very indebted to the VFW Post 283 for the wonderful work that they did here. We have quite a group of trees in this cemetery. These trees are at least 100 years old, some of them, way beyond their life expectancy, and during the subsequent hurricanes and disasters we've had, trees come down, and we are fortunate that we have community members that have come to our aid in helping us clean up the cemetery from these trees that fall down. And if you can see behind the flagpole there, you can see the size of that one tree. That's just a limb that sticks out there. But it takes major equipment to be able to deal with this kind of tree damage, and one of our board members, a man by the name of Rob Bresnahan, and his family's company and grandfather came in and removed several large trees at their own doing, and I can't emphasize how much that helps. Every time a tree comes down in the cemetery, it could be $1,000, $2,000, and the cemetery finances really cannot deal with that kind of expenditure over the long haul.
The following is a public service announcement test to determine if you need a fishing license and boat registration before you head out on the water. Let us begin. Are you a pelican? Does this look like your house? Is this your idea of fishing with friends? Do you use your feet as fishing hooks? Are you your own boat? Do you have webbed feet? No, I mean like a... That's the one. Do you want this in your favorite lake? Yuck, yike. No thanks, mister. Regardless how you answered, you need to be licensed and registered, because it helps local conservation efforts protect the very natural resources you enjoy boating and fishing in for generations to come. Do your part at takemefishing.org.
Hi, I'm Tony Brooks, the director of the Luzerne County Historical Society, and welcome to my neighborhood. As a little boy, I actually grew up here in 40 Fort, just down the street, and my paper route took me by the 40 Fort Cemetery every morning at 5 a.m. But when I would come home from school, I would play in this cemetery and get very curious of who the names are and the lives behind the people who were buried here. I happen to grow up on a street called Butler Street, and there are many Butlers buried here at 40 Fort. And I started to put two to two together and realized that the Butler family was a very important family going back to the Revolutionary War here in the Wyoming Valley. Well, welcome to the Wyoming Valley's west side on an area of our valley that we like to say is the Trail of History. Starting here at the 40 Fort Meeting House behind me, a wonderful gem of architecture that we're so proud to have, a one-of-a-kind piece in all of northeastern Pennsylvania. And it's very important that we continue to preserve this great structure. You know, in America today, with strip malls and malls, it all looks the same. But the building behind us makes this place special because there's only one 40 Fort Meeting House. And it's the oldest church edifice in all of Wyoming Valley, and actually all of northeastern Pennsylvania. As you continue here down Wyoming Avenue, which used to be called the Great Road, you'll come across another house owned by the Historical Society called the Nathan Dennison House. It's a house from the 1790s that was built by Colonel Nathan Dennison, and today children and families can come to it where we interpret what life was like on the Pennsylvania frontier in the 1790s. You know, a lot of people think to immigrate to America was easy, but imagine what it was like to come here from Connecticut to the middle of the woods and have to start from absolutely nothing. You had to chop down the trees just to build your very first house. And you can see what that was like in 1790 at the Nathan Dennison House. If you go farther down Wyoming Avenue, you'll come to the William Swetland Homestead, an 1803 house that was built on over successive generations starting in 1815 and again in the 1850s. And you can see what it was like for a family of farmers who later become wealthy through mining operations, railroads, and banking industry. And so how houses change and develop and get remodeled. We all do that today. Everyone still will remodel a house as if they won the lottery. So in the old days, when you dug coal and won the lottery, you would add on to your house, and you can see exactly what William Swetland did with his house. You go farther up the Wyoming Avenue into the borough of Wyoming, and on the right-hand side, you'll find the Wyoming Monument, an 1842 monument that was built in honor and memory of the 300-some patriots that lost their lives at the Battle and Massacre of Wyoming on July 3rd, 1778. So there are four wonderful properties that you can see along the Trail of History on the west side of the Wyoming Valley: the 40 Fort Meeting House, the Nathan Dennison House, the William Swetland Homestead, and the Wyoming Monument. Hope you'll join us sometime.